Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Selassie, and this is a lecture on African American political thought from 1915 to the present. Now, you've already heard a lecture of African American political thought that extends essentially from the antebellum years to 1915. So, this is the second part of this lecture. So, what we're trying to do is encapsulate the full breadth of thinking about African American politics from that long stretch of history to the present. And of course, we can't cover every single thing, but we're going to cover just some important kernels of information for you so you can have just a general picture about what this political thinking and the political actions and motivations were of Black people during this time period. Now, again, if you want to delve much deeper into these issues, you can take specific courses at your follow-on institution on civil rights or on Malcolm X or Martin Luther King's nonviolent activity, etc. So this is just, again, to give you just a basic fundamental overview. So let's go ahead and get this presentation going. Now, for some background into this period, we have to talk about a concept known as progressivism. This time period from about 1890 onward, and I would say this would last up to the Great Depression and the rise of Franklin Roosevelt, would be called the Progressive Era. Now, there were certainly progressive programs that stretched well into Franklin Roosevelt's with things like Social Security, etc. And certainly with Lyndon Johnson, we saw things with the Great Society. But really, we're talking about these progressive ideologies and programs that were just beginning to embed themselves within the American consciousness or psyche. Now, this was an organizational movement, but it was also a movement of leaders as well. So there were organizations that could have been considered to be progressive. I would argue that the NAACP was one of those progressive organizations. And there were also leaders that emerged that acted either independently of these organizations. And I guess to some degree, Theodore Roosevelt was a progressive, so we could count him in. He wasn't part of a organization per se, but he would fit into this idea of a leader. And we'll see other ones like Ida Tarbell, who I'll talk about in a minute. Du Bois was attached to the NAACP. He was the editor of the Crisis magazine. So we have individuals working within and without in some particular context of progressivism. And so what progressivism was, at its fundamental level, was a quest for equality. With African Americans, there was also a tenor that came in, was the idea of both personal and group self-defense. So not only do you have progressives who are championing new ideas to make society better, but you also had this idea for African Americans, one of gaining equality and also personal and group self-defense. So at its fundamental level, we could say that progressivism was a mass movement in American political, social, and economic life. In short, we can call it an optimistic vision. It was a direct, purposeful human intervention and all things social and economic to better society. Now, what some people have argued here, that there was a shift, a massive shift in the lines between the countryside and the city, that Americans had inherently been brought up prior to the 20th century on farms. And so what we begin to see after the 20th century, or when the 20th century begins after the 19th century, we begin to see more and more people leaving those farms and beginning to move to cities. And why would you suppose that's important? Probably I would argue that it's important because when people move to new locales, they have different things that they want from society, or their expectations about what government can provide for them begin to shift. For example, if you're living on a farm, you're dictated by the growing season, the planting season. So your whole life is dictated by planting, sowing, and harvesting. But if you live in the cities, your life is dictated by what we call time clock efficiency or Taylorism, scientific management. You have to get up in the morning, get ready for work, get ready for school. You have certain time limits to meet. Everybody's telling you when you need things due. At work, you have to produce a certain amount of output. You have middle managers. You have expectations. Your expectations and the expectations of people have on you change drastically. So think about that for a moment, that once you've planted your crop and you're waiting for your crop to spring up, what do? Sure, there are things for you to do around your farm. There's always plenty of stuff to be done, and you have to eat and that sort of thing. So cows need to be milked, and the animals need to be tended to, and clothes need to be mended, and barns need to be fixed. But in general, there's nobody demanding that you do any of that stuff. So there is a shift between you, the worker. We now have an emerging class of people called the middle class. There are foreigners, there are native born, there are men and women working cheek to jowl. So things began to shift dramatically, and the expectation is for government to respond. So there is widespread social activism and a demand for political reform. When you're on the farm, you probably don't see politicians very much. But when you're in the city, City Hall is just a few blocks down the corner. So if you think of City College, for example, it takes one just a mere couple of rides on the Red Line before you get to City Hall. So you have proximity and access to those politicians. And if they aren't delivering what your expectations of them are, certainly what you are going to do is to get active and demand political reform. And this is what people in the progressive era began to do. They started demanding, one, for the elimination in the corruption that they saw was inherent in government. What kinds of corruption? Well, what basically politicians did for a large degree. Now, it's not to say that they didn't do anything, because politicians did do things. But a lot of times what politicians would do was they would provide what we call patronage. Patronage is essentially where you have jobs and you need to give those jobs out to your friends or the people that helped you to get into office. So think about this, that you get elected as mayor and you now have control of, let's say, 300 city jobs, and your mother calls you on the phone and says that your cousin needs a job and that she wants you to give your cousin a job, and you know that your cousin is completely unqualified for that work, but you're going to give your cousin that work because he's family. So that's called a patronage. And what a large amount of politicians, whether they be presidents of the United States or mayors, is that they issued out patronage. And so one of the things that people wanted to do was institute what we call civil service reform, which was very much a progressive idea. Although we can look back and say that this idea was churning a little bit before the 1890s, but it really took off and gained substantial steam in the 1890s. The elimination of patronage, where civil service is that you can't just give your cousin a job. As a matter of fact, when you do that these days, people not only look down on it, but there may be some rules put in place to stop you from doing that. They would also do things like they'd build a building, right? They needed a new town hall. So what they would do is that they would order 50,000 brooms. And you say, well, why brooms? Well, who cares when you order a lot of brooms, because you can always say that we're always going to need brooms. So you order 50,000 brooms. And at 50,000 brooms at marked up price could be a couple of $1 million. And who gets the contract? Your cousin, who owns a broom wholesaling company. So you can see that when you watch the trucks roll up to City Hall and them unload 50,000 brooms, and you're wondering, what are you going to do with all those brooms? You realize that your goal is to eliminate corruption in government. And so you're going to target the election process to make sure that it is not corrupt, but you're also going to do things like you're going to look at corporations that are too big to fail. So in other words, in the last recession, if you guys are old enough to remember the last recession that we had, right before President Obama was elected into office with George W. Bush, who was elected, he left the government in tatters, and the country almost sank into a depression. And we had to, or Obama had to, bail out corporations because they were so large and employed so many people across so many sectors, like the car companies, Ford, GM, Chrysler, etc., that he had to bail them out, or hundreds of thousands into the millions of people would have been laid off from work, and that would have began the spiral of the Depression. Well, this was the same case moving into the 20th century, where we began to see corporations who had turned themselves into big holding companies and trust were so large that we began to break them up, because we knew if something like this happened, a depression happened, that we could not afford to bail these companies out. There were also things like giving women the right to vote. Women were kept away from voting because of discriminatory practices by men. And so a progressive idea was to extend what we call suffrage to women. There was also things like trying to get people to stop drinking. There was a prohibition of alcohol. You're probably thinking, wow, that's pretty bizarre. Why would they prohibit alcohol? Well, the reason for this is that Americans drink a lot. We were a society that was so drunk that companies began to introduce coffee into the workplace because people were coming to work so drunk that coffee was a thing that they could have to wake their employees up. So you're probably thinking that, oh, when you get up in the morning, we have coffee, and we get up in the morning, you have coffee because that's what offices do, is have coffee. No. We have coffee in offices because American workers would drink so much that in the mornings we needed something to get us going because we had massive hangovers and we're still drunk. So coffee was instituted. Well, coffee is just something that eventually became just a cultural norm. That's why Americans, we drink coffee, and people in England, they drink tea. The rest of Europe is coffee drinkers as well. In Italy, and elsewhere, people drink coffee. In the United States, we drink coffee. But for us, what we wanted to do with so many people drinking is prohibit them from getting drunk. So we stopped all sales of alcohol. This was a huge problem because men particularly would spend all their money in bars. So they'd get their paychecks, go to a bar and spend all their money, and then wouldn't have any money to feed their kids, or they would go and get drunk and beat up their families. So this is why prohibition was something that was instituted, and it was a progressive idea. It was a bad idea, but it was an idea. Now, during this time period, as we're moving into from the late 19th century into the 20th century, one of the political questions that whites pondered was what to do about black people. So as we talk about black people in this class, we use a lot of terminology. We use African American, Afro American. Sometimes you'll hear people just say African or black. But black people, their names have changed over the course of time, from Negro, colored, all of these different terminologies, until eventually to African American. Now, there was a question about what is it that we do with black people. So, for example, today, the big political question that is a battle between Democrats and Republicans is what to do about immigrants. So Think about this, where some people on the right say that all immigrants should be packed up and shipped off and sent back where they came from. And then you have people on the left who say that no, America was founded on immigrants and we should be welcoming to immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. Now, during the 19th century and the early 20th century, the big question was not so much about immigrants, although immigrants were coming to America and people were wringing their hands and worrying about those dark-skinned Italians and those dirty Irish people that were coming over. At least that's what the way that they characterized them as. People began to talk about in earnest, what do we do with black people? Black people, by and large, after the Civil War, there were about 4 million enslaved people of African descent, African Americans, and there were about 340,000 free black people who had never been enslaved in America. So the bigger question is what do you do with these black people? Well, it may not seem as obvious to you all why this was such a question, but it was. Now think about this. If you had 4 million black people who were enslaved, and then you freed them, they couldn't read, they couldn't write, most of them had never slept in beds, they didn't know anything about regular hygiene because they weren't given basic things like soap or toothbrushes or anything like that. As a matter of fact, most Americans didn't bathe regularly. So how is it that slaves were going to be bathing regularly? So you have all of these issues and problems. Black people don't know anything about contracts, about how to work and live in cities. Several years ago in Los Angeles, when there were a lot of Latin Americans coming to Los Angeles, people from Central America, Latinos and Latinx, one of the big problems, or people talked about this, was the fact that there were some people who were living in Los Angeles who were simply throwing their garbage out the windows. And this was a big topic in Los Angeles. And what some people had theorized was that there were just some people who were coming from Latin America who simply did not understand how to live in cities. Now, I find all of that stuff rather strange, and I really didn't know if I bought into any of all of that stuff, because I simply think that no matter where you live on the world, if you have garbage, people kind of generally know what a trash can is. But nevertheless, that was just a topic, a question, and people were saying that these people are coming here and they don't know how to live in America. This was the very same thing that was being said about African Americans. Now, I'm quite sure that African Americans knew what a trash can was, certainly that, and they had common sense enough to know to throw stuff in the trash can. But nevertheless, people do have to learn how to live in places that they're not accustomed to. So whether you're white, you're black, what have you, if you've come off a farm and you move into a city, you have to acclimatize yourself to the new conditions around you. So henceforth, the Negro question, what do we do with black people? But this Negro question posed certain thoughts or hypotheses or things that black people began to think about. And what they were thinking about is that, wow, white people are looking at black people less as a people and more as a problem. Because why do they have questions about who we are? Many white people believe that black people could not civilize themselves to a degree that they could fit into a modern growing America. And when I mean civilize, I'm talking about doing things like the normal rudimentary behaviors that we see people do today. So think about this. If you've lived on a plantation all your life and you've never slept in a bed and someone gives you a bed, most likely it's going to take you a little bit of time to get used to sleeping in a bed. Think about if those of you who've been in the military, or think about you've been camping, it takes you a little bit of time to get used to being outdoors and sleeping outdoors and doing everything outdoors. Well, for the most part, it's a reverse process. But there were also some things, because white people, many of them saw black people as a threat to their way of life. That black people were moving into the cities, trying to get jobs, looking for places to live. And so quite naturally, white people began to wring their hands and thinking about the ideas of why is it that so many black people are coming to the cities. So, and we think about this is that why this is a problem is because for many white people, they saw themselves as a city upon a hill. Now, if you're not familiar with this concept of city upon a hill, you can just Google this, the Puritans. And what it basically means is that Puritans began to see themselves, or they thought of themselves, as a shining beacon to the rest of the world. That they could, the world, particularly Europeans, could look upon the United States as a shining example of liberty and obedience to and deference to God, and to be able to live in a religious community. And so this, for a lot of white people, was an assault on their idea of having built a Puritan city upon a hill. Whites were determined to keep black people in their place, to control them both socially and economically. And how they would do that is essentially through violence. Now, what they wanted to have was a dependent, permanent underclass of citizens. Why? Well, what you can think about is that you can have your steady supply of maids, butlers. You can have a steady supply of people who will do all the kinds of jobs that white people see as beneath them. Now, whether you question it or not, none of you are going to college because you want to go work at McDonald's. That's not something that you're going to college to do. Now, you may probably say something like, wow, I'm going to go to college and get a business degree and I'm going to own a McDonald's, which is far different than saying, wow, I'm going to go to college and get a business degree so I can go work at McDonald's. People who have master's degrees from UCLA don't go work at Burger King. They just won't do it. So what I'm arguing here is that whites wanted to keep black people in control so they could preserve their idea of a pure white America. And if they had to live around blacks, that they would control them through violence, both socially and economically, so black people could not rise to the same level that they saw themselves on. They also feared black men. And it's not that they feared black men because black men were somehow going to snatch their purses, because generally speaking, the average white person in America doesn't know any black people. They don't know any Asian people, and they don't know any Latinos. The average. When we look at American society today, we see that we live in a very segregated world. America is extremely segregated. That if you're a minority, chances are you probably do have friends that are minorities. But if you're a white person in America, because this is a segregated society, that the chances of you having any black friends is just astronomically nil. What they feared is black male sexuality. This has always been a problem in America when the first black men arrived in America. You've heard of the terms, if you're black, the mandingo or the black buck. What was at stake for white people was what they called white female Victorian chastity and purity. And what we mean by Victorian, we're looking at the Victorian age. So if you're not familiar, you can Google that really quickly and see what the Victorian age was about. So what this was about was a fear, a unrealized fear, a crazed fear, a unsupported and unsubstantiated fear that black men were going to rape white women. And I'm going to tell you a story in just a moment about this that will give you some clue about the fears that white people had about black men. Now, violence, as I stated, was the principal means of control for the black community, what we would call racial terrorism. And this was terrorism writ large. In 1892, there were 241 black people lynched, 66% of them black. So you're asking yourself, what about the the 30% or so of white people, or 35% of white people or so, who were lynched, right? Because you have 66% of black people here were lynched. So those white people who were lynched were either foreigners like Italians, or they were white people who were trying to help black people. Now think about that. If you're trying to help a black person and you're white, they're going to come lynch you too. By 1882 through 1968, 4,743 people were lynched. Black people, or people in general, were lynched. Of these, 3,446 were black. The vast majority were black. This was racial terrorism at its best. And who committed these crimes? Well, sometimes it was the police, sometimes it was the Klan, sometimes it was just ordinary citizens who were angry at black people for all sorts of things, and they lynched them. They lynched kids, they lynched men, they lynched women. There were women who were pregnant where they cut babies out of their stomachs. This was ad hoc racial terrorism through 1968. So for me, I was born before 1968. So during my lifetime, they were still lynching black people. The most oppressive states were Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama. And as we stated, there were other people who were lynched as well. Italians, Jews, they lynched Native Americans wholesale. You name it. So here are some pictures of lynchings. They often would tie people to trees, black people to trees, and set them afire. They'd cut off their genitals, ears, fingers, sell them. They would, like the photograph on the left, postcards. That was a big thing. They would take photographs and turn them into postcards. So you'd get a postcard from your grandmother, Jenny, and on the back, she's wishing you a happy birthday, and you turn the card over, and there's a black person lynched. They would even display ears and fingers in department store windows. This is Elmer Jackson, right? And Isaac McGee and Elias Clayton. You can see their bodies down below. They were lynched, and people gladly took photographs. Right? This is one in Waco, Texas, where an African American was lynched and then burned. You can see his body down at the bottom near the tree that is just burned. Thousands of people showed up. Now, what's interesting about this lynching here is that the U.S. Supreme Court forbid the sheriff from releasing this person, but the sheriff let the mob do it, and they burned the person. They lynched the black person. Racial terrorism. And these aren't Klan members. These are ordinary people that would have lived. They would have lived next door to you, or you would have seen them walking down the street. Walk into a store, they might have served you. Right? People being pulled up, their younger kids being pulled up to get a better look. Now, there were protests against lynching. There were people who were fighting against it. The first protesters against lynching were, of course, black women. Black women were our best and foremost and most impressive of our protesters. I.D.B. Wells was the most important of these black women protesters. She led what they called the Anti-Lynching Crusaders. She's formed the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching in 1930. There's Ida. Born in 1862, Holly Springs, Mississippi. Her parents were actually slaves. She attended Rusk College, which is a phenomenal feat for a first-generation college graduate, and she became co-owner of a newspaper. If you don't know anything about I.D.B. Wells, you should spend some time in looking her up. She is a fascinating and remarkable person. There were bounties on I.D.B. Wells' head, but she was a fearless protester. She wrote a newspaper called the Free Speech and the Headlight, articles on lynching. She encouraged black Southerners to move west. She traveled to England and gave speeches about the lynchings that took place in the United States. She eventually had to leave the South because the death threats became so ominous. So she moved to Chicago and took up and founded the Women's Era Club, which is the first civic organization for women. She published a document in 1895 called A Red Record. And that document essentially had within it the the ideas of a lynching, or how many people were lynched. It was a recordation of lynchings. Now, I.D.B. Wells would go on to essentially marry. She married Ferdinand Barnett, who was an attorney in the United States. She was one of the organizers of a group called the Committee of 40, helped to organize the NAACP, Crusader of Civil Rights, until her death. And she today remains a stalwart in anybody who is doing any research on lynchings in America. Now, the civil rights movement is our next important idea to think about and to talk about in this time period, moving into the 20th century. Civil rights would take a predominant role in where black politicians, or those who would aspire to be politicians, and black organizers would focus their attention. There were really important civil rights groups: the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. They were also called the Freedom Riders. And there was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So you had the NAACP, SNCC, CORE, and SCLC. SNCC and CORE were essentially made up of young people, mostly college students, but very young people as yourselves. The NAACP and the SCLC were made up of black leaders within the community. The NAACP was also a multiracial coalition where there were whites and blacks, Jews, etc., who helped to found the NAACP. And this organization was foremost interested in breaking down the walls of segregation. SNCC and CORE were also interested in breaking down the barriers of segregation, and what they would do is try to protest segregation through sit-ins. So they would literally go to a place where black people were not allowed and just go in and sit down. So if, for example, in a lunch counter where black people were not allowed, they would go and sit down all day. They would get beat up, arrested, threatened, but they kept up this practice until the stores eventually gave in and desegregated. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference was an organization of ministers, largely in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. was the principal organizer and president of the SCLC. Martin Luther King, most of you are probably familiar with him to some degree. He was born in 1929 and was assassinated in 1968. As I said just a second ago, he was head of the SCLC. His idea and how to defeat segregation was through nonviolence, by using a term, satyagraha, which was a tool used by Gandhi to bring down the British Empire in India, the idea of nonviolence. Now, I just have to say this really quickly. Martin Luther King was not a proponent of nonviolence per se. What I mean by that is that nonviolence is a weapon, a tool. It is one of many tools in an arsenal that you are going to use against injustice. What do I mean by that? If you would have walked into Martin Luther King's house, you would have seen throughout the house guns. Martin Luther King tried to get a gun permit so he could carry a gun. Most people don't realize that, particularly Republicans who will say things like, oh, why are these people protesting? Martin Luther King believed in nonviolence. Yes, he did, but he also believed in violence. Martin Luther King's philosophy was essentially this. If black people tried to use violence in the United States to get their rights, he believed that black people would be wiped out, that white people in America were so violent and racist that they would just kill black people indiscriminately. Now, if you are kind of wondering, like, well, where did this nonviolent thing come from? Martin Luther King had studied while he was a student at Crozier Theological Seminary. He studied the ideas of nonviolence and how nonviolence could be used as a tool. Now, for example, in South Africa, with the apartheid regime, there was talk about using nonviolence as a tool to bring down the apartheid racist South African all-white regime. But people tossed that aside because they fundamentally understood that in South Africa, in Africa in general, that whites were so racist that if they tried to protest nonviolently, and they tried this, that they would just be shot. Look up Sharpsville. Black people walking down the street protesting nonviolence, the police would just come out and shoot them. So they fundamentally realized, and King talked about this, that in South Africa and the rest of Africa, if you want your rights, you're going to have to pick up a gun. Black people, Africans in Africa, did not win their freedom through nonviolent protest. It just wouldn't work. The Europeans would have just murdered black people. So you had to pick up a gun and create an army and wrest your independence from Africa. Africa is a lot different than the United States. In the United States, if you walk down the street and people shot you, white people in the United States would essentially be so embarrassed by this that they would demand that black people get their rights. And I'll give you a perfect example. Ahmaud Arbery was running down the street, getting some exercise. What happened to him? He essentially was shot on the street. So Martin Luther King fundamentally knew that white Americans would just shoot you. So what you had to do is protest non-violently in America, because then when you got shot, then other whites would say time out. And that's exactly what has happened to George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and etc. Good white people have basically looked at that and said enough is enough. Most of the rioting in America in the last month has not been by black people. It's been by white people who are pissed off at other white people for being so racist. So what we have here is the early throes of what we call liberation theology, using spiritual teachings to liberate black people. Now, the other flip side of this is black militancy. Now, I've just been talking to you in great deal about this idea and the concept of nonviolent protest as a means to moving the needle in terms of civil rights. And that's what happened in the United States. But there was an undercurrent of black militancy that had been sort of fermenting. We often think about people like Malcolm X, maybe even the Black Panthers, and those are all true. Malcolm X was the antithesis of Martin Luther King. And for many black Americans, they fundamentally understood, because I remember this as a young person, people saying things like, well, you better be thankful that there's Martin Luther King, because if it wasn't for Martin Luther King, Malcolm X would be leading black people. So there was always an undercurrent or an undertone of black militancy. And this goes way back into the 18th and 19th century with a man by the name of David Walker. Now, David Walker was an African American abolitionist, and he wrote a treatise called A Preamble to the Colored Citizens of the World, or an appeal to the colored citizens of the world. And this preamble essentially was a preamble about black people becoming militant. David Walker was actually born free. His mother was a free person, but his father was a slave. Now, his father died early, so David Walker never had the opportunity to meet his father, but David Walker himself was born free because his mother was freed. Now, this is a Latin term that they call partus, P-A-R-T-U-S, which means that which is brought forth follows the womb. In other words, whatever the status is of your mother, that is going to be your status. So if your mother was a slave and you were a slave. If your mother was born free, you were born free. So it didn't matter what the status is of the father. It always mattered what the status was of the mother. Now, why would you suppose they would do the mother? Because sometimes we just don't know who the father is. You can't be sure until you do a DNA test. Well, and during this time period, before DNA tests were made, a woman could always say he's not the father. And how could you say that that's not true? But you can always see the child coming out of the womb, right? You know that. So whatever the status is of the mother, that's the status of the child. Now, David Walker was born in Wilmington, North Carolina, and we believe around 1796, but we're not really actually sure when he was born. He was educated because there was no prohibition on black people learning how to read. And by around 1815 or so, he then moved to Boston. Of course, North Carolina during this time period in the 1800s was slave state. And so he moved to Boston where it was a free state. And you would do this primarily because you might be afraid that somebody would kidnap you and send you deep into the South. So you moved to someplace safe. He was an agent for Freedom's Journal, a abolitionist newspaper, and he published this appeal, the Appeal to the Colored Citizens, in 1828. One of the interesting notes about David Walker's appeal was that it was smuggled into the South by people who were sailors, black seamen. Now, what these sailors did is they would put the appeal in their coats, in their pea coats. So they would undo the lining, shove a couple of appeals in the lining, sew it up, and when they were on board ship, the captains, who were obviously white, couldn't tell that they had these in their hands, and so they could go to a black church, undo the seam, and then spread out the appeal. Now, the appeal itself was discovered by white people in the South, by the police, and of course the governor was informed, and there essentially was a bounty put on David Walker's head for inciting slaves to gain their freedom. At one point, there was a 10,000 bounty for him alive and about another 1,000 bounty for him dead. Louisiana went so far because they were so afraid of the circumstances that they barred free black people from entering Louisiana after 1825. Now, you're asking, what is the David Walker's appeal? Now, essentially, David Walker basically said that black people needed to pay attention to the inequality and inequities of black life, particularly slavery, and that he said that black people should, both free and slave, act according to their religious and political principles. He argued that whites were so racist that there was no arguing with white people, that black people must strike for their freedom. So what he was calling for, in essence, was a revolution. One of the other most important movements of black militancy happened in Monroe, North Carolina in the 1950s. If you pay attention to black popular culture, you'll kind of notice that there is somewhat of a thesis or an idea that permeates that black people cannot swim. Now, you're probably wondering, why is that an issue that black people can't swim? Well, the foremost issue with this is that swimming holes, because most black people lived in the South, and in some cases in the North, swimming holes were off limits to black people. And the swimming holes that were permitting black people to swim were the most dangerous swimming holes. Rocks, all kinds of projections and projectiles were in the water, shallow, just not good. Some of these swimming holes had whirlpools. So what would end up happening is that lots of black children would die from drowning. So as pools began to be built across America, black people then turned their attention, instead of swimming in these dangerous swimming holes, they decided to go swim in these new public pools that were being built with their tax dollars. Well, those public pools were, in essence, segregated. Black people, even though their tax dollars went to build those pools, were prohibited from swimming in those pools. And that's largely for all minorities. If you were not white, you were not permitted in those pools. Or what they would do is that they would have pool days. Normally in the North, they would just have pool days. So Latinos and blacks and Asians could swim on, let's say, Sunday, and whites would swim in the pool on Saturday. In the South, largely prohibited. So what black people did is that they realized that swimming in those swimming holes were so dangerous that they began to demand entry into these public pools. And a man by the name of Robert F. Williams was one of the first black people to demand that young black children get entry into those pools. 1925 to 1996, Robert Williams was a civil rights leader and a president of a chapter of the NAACP. His grandmother had been a slave, and he had been given guns and trained how to shoot at an early age, then served in the U.S. Army at the end of World War II. Here is a wanted handbill for his arrest for interstate flight and kidnapping. And of course, this was all trumped up charges and lies. Eventually, Robert Williams would escape the United States and go to Cuba, where when he was in Cuba, he and Fidel Castro built what they called Radio Free Dixie. If you don't know it, that there is a radio station called Radio Free America that the Americans built in the 1950s to broadcast to communist countries, to broadcast music, politics, to try to get people in those communist countries to understand American way of life. Well, Castro and Robert F. Williams put together Radio Free Dixie, Dixie being the name of the South, Dixieland. And they broadcast news about black people, music, particularly jazz. They did everything possible to broadcast into black and white homes in the South topics about civil rights, correcting the lies being told about black people. Robert F. Williams would write a treatise called Negro with Guns that heavily influenced Huey P. Newton, who actually took the Robert Williams logo, the Panther, and used it as their own. There was another incident that essentially made Robert Williams, and I'll go back here just a little bit, that made Robert Williams famous, was an incident that happened called the kissing case. Now, why this is important is because it made Robert Williams somewhat famous and gave him some credibility. And the kissing case is one of the most fascinating incidents that I've ever heard of. And I'll just go over the topics here. In 1958, there were two African American boys, and they were ages 7 and 9 years old. I'm trying to do all of this by memory, so you'll have to forgive me. The boys' names were James Thompson and David Simpson. While they were growing up as little toddlers, their mother was essentially, one of the boys' mothers was essentially a housemaid for a young girl named Sissy Marcus. So they would bring the two boys during the day to play with the younger daughter, this Sissy Marcus. And so the three of them kind of grew up together. So they were, in essence, play brothers and play sisters. When Sissy was about 7 or 8 years old, I believe at school, she kissed on the cheek her two black friends, James and David. Later on that afternoon, when the young girl, Sissy, came home, she told her mother that she had seen the boys and kissed them on the cheek. The mother became so enraged that she called the police and accused the two young boys of rape. The two boys were arrested by the police, and for a week they were held in a prison without charges, and they were beaten and threatened into confessing. After spending 3 months in jail, the boys were eventually charged and convicted of molestation. One of the boys remained in jail until he was 21 years of age. This became a celebrated case during the time period, and Robert Williams had spent a great deal of time trying to convince the governor, a Luther Hodge, to eventually pardon the children, which he did. He pardoned them, but he did not apologize for the treatment that these boys faced. Now, this is the kind of thing that helped spur Robert Williams into pledging that black people ought to take up armed struggle to protect themselves. The next group of people are the Deacons for Self-Defense. The Deacons for Self-Defense were formed in 1964 in Jonesboro, Louisiana by Ernest Thomas and Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick, who were both World War II and Korean War veterans. The Deacons for Self-Defense became so popular that 21 chapters spread throughout the South. Their real name was actually I think it's the Deacons for Self-Defense rather than just the Deacons for Defense. What really made them famous is that they had a standoff with the Ku Klux Klan. And why the standoff is because the Klan in Louisiana had been terrorizing the black community. They burned churches, Masonic halls, meeting centers, black families, shot into their homes. It was so bad that this group literally had to go and try to kill the Klan to try to get them to stop. J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had investigated this group and used a thing called COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, to try to destroy this organization. But this was a very formal and militant organization. Now, what we've been seeing here is the tensions within these civil rights groups between the use of nonviolent protest and violence. The civil rights movement began to grow, as you've seen with Robert Williams and the Deacons for Self-Defense. It was beginning to grow more militant over time. Most of you who've heard of Malcolm X or Malcolm Little, 1925 to 1965, he was assassinated himself. And there is a fascinating movie or a documentary on who killed Malcolm X. I haven't watched all of it, but I've watched parts of it. You should delve into that. There was also an interesting movie about the Deacons for Defense. This one starred Bill Duke and Forrest Whitaker. That came out in 2003, so it's a number of years old now, but it's a really decent movie that'll explain more in detail about that group. So Malcolm X was about black liberation and self-defense. He was a member of the Nation of Islam. He would eventually break from that movement and form his Organization of Afro-American Unity. There was the Black Panther Party for self-defense, and of course that you know that the Deacons for Self-Defense. So the Black Panthers followed those organizations along with Robert Williams' organization to create this party in 1966. In Oakland, California, Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale were its leaders. There is Huey Newton in his famous photograph. They came up with a 10-point program for black people. The 10-point program is as follows. We want power to determine the destiny of our black oppressed communities, full employment for our people, the end to the robbery of black communities. And what they mean by this is that there were people coming from the outside of the black community, establishing stores, not hiring black people, and taking money from them. We want decent housing, education that teaches us our true history, free health care for all black and oppressed people, the end to police brutality and the murder of black people, end the wars of aggression, freedom for black people who they believed were political prisoners. Most black people who were arrested, when they would get a trial, they would face all white juries, and the convictions were harsh. Land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, peace, and the people's community control of modern technology. The Black Panthers put together free breakfast programs for children. They fed more poor kids in America than the U.S. government. Free medical clinics were established, clothing, emergency response, drug and alcohol rehabilitation, free ambulance service, free food programs. The Black Panthers were a phenomenal organization. They were eventually destroyed by the CIA and the FBI with the help of local police forces such as the LAPD and the Chicago Police Departments. By the time we get to the 1970s, we are now seeing a growing list of black people becoming leaders throughout America. There was Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, Coleman Young in Detroit, Ted Berry in Cincinnati, James Ford in Tallahassee, and Walter Washington in D.C., and then Richard Arrington in Birmingham. So as black people were moving off those farms and out of the South, they were moving into northern cities, and the demographics began to shift where black people were now the majorities in cities, where white people were fleeing the cities, trying to get away from black people and moving out to suburbs. And so black people were then taking control of those cities. In the 80s, it was Harold Washington in Chicago, Wilson Goode in Philadelphia, James Sharp in Flint, Lottie Shackelford in Little Rock, James Hawley in Portsmouth. There was Henry Gant in Charlotte. So lots of black leadership in cities throughout the United States. There is Jesse Jackson, born in 1941. Jesse Jackson would run for president of the United States twice. He worked with Martin Luther King as a young man, and he would go on to form the Rainbow Coalition. I actually thought that Jesse Jackson had a chance to become president in 1988. There were a lot of white people who supported him, and he won a couple of state primaries. There was a lot of interest in what Jesse Jackson was saying, but the times were just not right for it. Okay, so that concludes our African American political thought from 1915 to the present. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.